In November 1864, William Tecumseh Sherman made a decision that every general in Washington thought was suicide. Every military textbook said it was madness. Grant had doubts. Lincoln had doubts. The War Department had doubts. Sherman had none. He was going to take 62,000 men, abandon his supply line, cut his telegraph wire, walk away from his base, and march 300 miles through the heart of enemy territory with no reinforcements, no communication, and no plan for retreat. There was no precedent for this. Armies do not cut their own lifelines. Armies do not walk into enemy country and hope the land feeds them. Armies do not go silent for 5 weeks and leave their own president guessing where they are. But Sherman was not most generals. Sherman paced. He always paced. His staff learned to stay out of his way. And when Sherman paced, it meant his mind was running faster than anyone could follow. He had looked at the map. He had looked at Georgia. He had counted the farms, the cotton gins, the railroads, the livestock. He had calculated what 62,000 men needed to eat per day, and he had concluded that Georgia could feed his army better than his own supply wagons could. His eyes moved constantly, scanning, always scanning. He scanned Georgia the way a fire scans a forest, looking for what will burn, what will feed the flame, what will be left when the fire passes. He spoke fast, almost too fast, the words tumbling over each other when he explained it to Grant. The logic was simple. Hood's Confederate army had gone north to Tennessee. Sherman could chase Hood, or he could ignore Hood entirely, march south to the sea, and destroy everything in his path. Everyone said he was insane for leaving Hood behind him. Sherman said no. Destroy what feeds the enemy army, destroy the farms, the railroads, the factories, the will of the people who support it. He sent Grant a telegram with 5 words that would become the overture to the most devastating march in military history. I can make Georgia howl. Grant trusted him. Lincoln, when asked, said something remarkable. I know what hole he went in, but I can't tell you what hole he'll come out of. That was the last anyone heard from Sherman for 5 weeks. November 15, 1864, the day it began. Sherman had already told Atlanta's civilians to leave. He had written a letter to the mayor, the most famous military letter ever written, explaining in brutal, unflinching language why their city had to burn. War is cruelty and you cannot refine it, he wrote. He wrote it in 20 minutes. He did not revise it. He did not need to. Now he stood on a hill outside the city and watched Atlanta burn. His engineers had set fire to the railroads, the roundhouses, the machine shops, the warehouses, anything with military value. But fire does not read orders. Fire does not distinguish between a weapons depot and a church. The flames jumped from building to building. 90% of Atlanta was destroyed. Sherman looked at the fire. He understood fire better than any man alive. He understood what it took and what it left behind. He understood that fire was not a weapon of precision, it was a weapon of totality, and that was exactly what he needed. His men formed up and marched out of the burning city. 62,000 men in 2 wings, the right wing under Oliver Howard, the left wing under Henry Slocum. 4 corps, cavalry under Judson Kilpatrick. They carried 20 days' rations. After that, they would eat Georgia. As they marched, they sang. Thousands of voices rising over the crackle of the burning city behind them. The song would become famous, Marching Through Georgia. They sang it as the sky behind them turned red and black. They sang it as they walked into enemy territory with nothing but the guns on their shoulders and the faith that their general knew what he was doing. Sherman rode at the center of the column. His uniform was wrinkled as always. His red hair, going gray now, stuck out from under his hat. His cigar was clenched between his teeth. He did not look back at Atlanta. That was Sherman. He burned things and kept moving. Behind him, Atlanta glowed against the November sky. Ahead lay 300 miles of Georgia, and not a single supply wagon was going to follow him. The march to the sea had begun. Before the army left Atlanta, Sherman issued Special Field Order Number 120. It was the document that governed the march to the sea. And buried inside its military language was an instruction that would change the war, change the South, and change the definition of warfare itself. The order said the army would forage liberally on the country during the march. 2 words, forage liberally. They sounded almost gentle. They were not gentle. They were a license to take everything Georgia had. The order laid out rules. Foraging parties, organized groups of soldiers, would be sent out each morning under the command of officers. They would gather food, livestock, and supplies from the farms and plantations along the route. They would take what the army needed. Soldiers were told to discriminate between the rich, who were mostly hostile, and the poor, who were mostly not. In practice, the distinction blurred almost immediately. Sherman divided his army into 2 wings marching on parallel roads, cutting a path of destruction 60 miles wide. A narrow column could be resisted. A 60-mile swath could not. There was no Confederate force in Georgia large enough to stop it. The order also said something else. It said that corps commanders had the authority to destroy mills, houses, cotton gins, and anything else in districts where the army was harassed by guerrillas or where bridges and roads were sabotaged. This gave local commanders enormous discretionary power. And discretionary power in wartime given to men who have been fighting for 3 years does not stay discreet for long. Sherman knew this. He was honest. The way a blade is sharp. It cut in both directions. He knew that forage liberally would become take everything. He knew that destroy mills in hostile districts would become burn everything that stands. He issued the order anyway, because Sherman had decided that the way to end this war was not to defeat the Confederate army. It was to destroy the Confederate economy. Not the soldiers, the farms that fed them, the railroads that moved them, the cotton that paid for them, the will that sustained them. This was not how wars had been fought before. This was something new. Sherman did not invent total war, but he wrote its operating manual, and Special Field Order Number 120 was page 1. The railroads were the first to die. Sherman understood infrastructure the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He knew that the railroads were the arteries of the Confederacy. Cut them, and the body dies. Not immediately, slowly, painfully, irreversibly. Without railroads, the South could not move troops, could not move food, could not move ammunition, could not function as a modern nation at war. So he destroyed every mile of railroad track his army crossed. 425 miles of track. And he did not just destroy them. He turned destruction into an art form. His men developed a system. They pried the rails off the wooden ties. They stacked the ties into enormous bonfires. They laid the iron rails across the top. When the middle of the rail glowed red with heat, teams of soldiers grabbed both ends and twisted the softened iron around the nearest tree or telegraph pole. The result was a spiral of iron wrapped so tightly around the trunk that it could never be straightened and reused. You would have to melt it down and reforge it. And the South no longer had the foundries to do that. The soldiers called them Sherman's neckties. Some twisted the rails into bow tie shapes. Some wrapped them into loops. Some bent them into the letters U and S, a final insult stamped in iron. The men competed to see who could make the most creative necktie. It became entertainment. 62,000 men marching through Georgia, turning the South's railroad system into modern art. Some of those twisted rails are still in museums today. Sherman's neckties are the most physical, tangible evidence of the march to the sea. Iron proof that an army passed through here and left nothing behind that worked. But the railroads were not all. Sherman's men destroyed telegraph lines, burned cotton gins. Cotton was the South's economic engine. Burned warehouses, bridges, and factories. They killed livestock they could not carry. Sherman estimated the total damage at $100 million. In 1,864. Adjusted for inflation, it is beyond calculation. He said 80 million of it was wanton destruction. Unnecessary, excessive, beyond what the army needed. He admitted it publicly. He did not apologize for anything. And then there were the bummers. That was what they called them. The foragers who went beyond foraging. The soldiers who took the order to forage liberally and interpreted it as liberally as the English language allows. They were supposed to be organized parties under officer command. Many of them were not. They were freelancers, rogues, men who had been fighting for 3 years and have learned that war erases the line between taking what you need and taking what you want. The bummers left the column each morning, sometimes in groups, sometimes alone. They fanned out across the countryside on stolen horses. They went to farms, plantations, anywhere there was food or valuables. They took everything. Not just food, silverware, jewelry, clothing, furniture. One bummer was seen riding a mule while holding a grandfather clock. Another carried a bird cage with a live parrot. Some of it was absurd. Some of it was criminal. The bummers burned houses that Sherman had not ordered burned. They terrorized families. The darker stories include violence that Sherman's orders explicitly forbade but that his army could not prevent. Sherman knew about the bummers. He knew what they were doing. He tried to control them. At times he ordered men arrested and punished. But an army of 62,000 men spread across 60 miles of countryside, with no central communication, no telegraph, no supply line tying them to a base, that army is a force of nature more than a military organization. Sherman himself said it. Every army is a mob. The bummers were the shadow of the march. They were the price of total war. Sherman had decided to make war on the Southern economy, on the Southern infrastructure, on the Southern will. But you cannot aim a fire. You can start it, you can point it in a direction, but once it is burning, it goes where it goes. And the bummers went where they went. The South remembered the bummers longer than they remembered the battles. 160 years later, families in Georgia still tell stories passed down through generations about the day the bummers came. The march to the sea was strategy. The bummers were the human cost of that strategy. As Sherman's army moved through Georgia, it set something free that it did not fully understand. And it was not fire. It was people. The slaves heard the army coming before they saw it. The sound carried for miles. 62,000 boots on dirt roads, wagon wheels, artillery caissons, horses, mules, and the singing. Always the singing. The slaves on the plantations heard that sound, and they knew what it meant. It meant the war had arrived. It meant the Union was here. It meant freedom. They came out of the slave quarters. They came from the fields. They came from the kitchens of the plantation houses where they had cooked meals for the families that owned them. They came with nothing. No shoes, no food, no plan. They came because the army was moving, and freedom was moving with it. 25,000 freed slaves followed Sherman's army during the march to the sea. Men, women, children, and elderly people walking behind a column of soldiers, sleeping in the open, eating whatever scraps the army left behind. They called Sherman Moses. Sherman was uncomfortable with it. He was not an abolitionist. He was not fighting to free slaves. He was fighting to save the Union. The freedom of the slaves was a consequence of his strategy, not its purpose. Sherman was honest, the way a blade is sharp. It cut in both directions. He did not know what to do with 25,000 people following his army. They slowed the march. They consumed resources. They clogged the roads. They were vulnerable to Confederate cavalry raids. And Sherman, the man who calculated everything, had not calculated this. He had not planned for liberation. He had planned for destruction. Some of his officers were kind to the freed people. Some were not. Some shared rations. Some drove them away. The Army's attitude toward the black civilians trailing behind them was as inconsistent as America itself. Generous in one mile, cruel in the next, indifferent in between. But the freed slaves kept coming. They kept following. Because behind them was slavery, and ahead of them was the Army. And the Army, whatever its flaws, whatever its indifference, whatever its cruelty, was moving toward freedom. So they walked, barefoot, hungry, and free, for the first time in their lives. December 9th, 1864, the darkest day of the march. Sherman's army reached Ebenezer Creek in eastern Georgia. It was not a river, but it was deep, swollen with winter rain and freezing cold. General Jefferson C. Davis, a Union general, no relation to the Confederate president, commanded the rear of the column. His corps needed to cross the creek quickly. Confederate cavalry under Joe Wheeler was pressing from behind. Davis ordered a pontoon bridge built. His troops crossed, his wagons crossed, his artillery crossed. Behind the troops, hundreds of freed slaves waited to cross. Men, women, children, elderly people who had been following the army for days, who had walked barefoot through Georgia, who had left everything they had ever known because this army meant freedom. When the last Union soldier crossed, Davis ordered the pontoon bridge pulled up. He pulled it up with the freed slaves still on the other side. Hundreds of people standing at the bank of a freezing creek, watching the bridge they were going to cross disappear into the water. Behind them, the sound of Confederate cavalry getting closer. What happened next is one of the worst moments in the entire Civil War. The freed slaves, trapped between the creek and the approaching Confederates, panicked. Some rushed into the water. Mothers carried children. Old men waded in up to their necks. Many could not swim. Some made it across. Many did not. The exact number who drowned is unknown. Estimates range from dozens to several hundred. Nobody counted them. Nobody buried them. Those who did not drown and did not cross were captured by Wheeler's cavalry and returned to slavery. They had tasted freedom for a few days, walked behind an army that they believed was leading them to a new life, and then they were sent back to the plantation. That is a cruelty that Sherman's phrase, "war is hell," does not begin to cover. Sherman did not order it. He was miles ahead, but he was the commanding general. When Secretary of War Stanton came to Savannah to investigate, Sherman sat with 20 black ministers and answered for what happened. The ministers told him what they wanted: land. Give us land. 4 days later, Sherman wrote Special Field Order Number 15, 40 acres of coastal land for every freed black family. Andrew Johnson reversed it within months. The land went back to the plantation owners. The freed people got nothing. For 5 weeks, the world heard nothing. Sherman had cut his telegraph wire when he left Atlanta. That was not an accident. That was strategy. He did not want Washington telling him what to do. He did not want the War Department second-guessing his decisions. He did not want the newspapers tracking his movements. He wanted silence, and he got it. In Washington, Lincoln waited. Grant waited. The War Department waited. Every day with no word from Sherman was another day of imagining the worst. Had he been ambushed? Had his army been destroyed? Had the Confederates surrounded him somewhere in the Georgia interior? Nobody knew. The most powerful army in the Western theater had simply disappeared. The newspapers speculated wildly. The same newspapers that had called Sherman insane in 1861 now wrote stories about his army being trapped, starving, defeated. They wrote obituaries for an army that was eating better than it had in months. Sherman's men were feasting on Georgia's harvest: sweet potatoes, corn, fresh pork, chickens, honey. They ate better on the march than they had in their permanent camps. Sherman moved his army at 15 miles a day, not fast, not slow. The pace of destruction. Each morning the foraging parties went out. Each evening they returned with wagons full of food and the horizon full of smoke. The army moved like a fire moves, steady, relentless, consuming everything in its path and leaving nothing behind. Confederate General William Hardee had a small force in Savannah, but nothing that could stop 62,000 men. The Georgia militia tried to slow Sherman, burning bridges, felling trees, but it was like throwing cups of water at a forest fire. Sherman's engineers rebuilt bridges in hours. Nothing stopped the march. The silence was not just strategic, it was psychological. As long as nobody knew where his army was, everyone in Georgia was afraid. Every town thought it was next. The silence was a weapon as powerful as any cannon. And inside that silence, Sherman thought. He paced. Even on horseback, his body moved with that restless energy that never left him. He thought about what he was doing to Georgia and what it would mean. He thought about the freed slaves following his army. Sherman's mind never stopped. That was his gift and his curse. December 21st, 1864. Sherman came out of the silence. His army reached the outskirts of Savannah and found the city defended by 10,000 Confederate troops under General Hardee. Sherman prepared for a siege. He reconnected with the Union Navy on the coast, his first contact with the outside world in 5 weeks. Ships arrived with mail, fresh supplies, and news. His army had been given up for lost. Now here it was, intact, fed, victorious, standing at the gates of one of the most beautiful cities in the South. Hardee knew he could not hold Savannah against 62,000 men. On the night of December 20th, he evacuated his garrison across the Savannah River on a pontoon bridge of his own. When Sherman's men entered the city the next morning, it was empty of soldiers. Savannah surrendered without a shot. Sherman did something he had not done in Atlanta. He spared Savannah. The city was not burned. The homes were not looted. The civilians were treated with something approaching courtesy. Sherman admired Savannah, its beauty, its squares, its architecture. He set up headquarters in a mansion and slept in a real bed for the first time in weeks. Then he sat down and wrote a telegram to Abraham Lincoln, the most remarkable telegram in the war. It said, "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." A Christmas gift. A general giving his president a city for Christmas. Lincoln received it on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas. The march that everyone had said was suicide had succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. Sherman had crossed 300 miles of enemy territory, destroyed everything in his path, and emerged at the coast with his army intact and a city in his pocket. In 5 weeks, Sherman had destroyed 425 miles of railroad, burned countless cotton gins and warehouses, seized millions of dollars worth of supplies, freed 25,000 slaves, and proven that you could win a war without fighting battles. You could win by destroying the enemy's ability to fight. The march to the sea was over. 300 miles, 5 weeks, $100 million in damage, and a new kind of war had been born. The march to the sea was 300 miles long, 60 miles wide, and 160 years deep. It has never ended. Not really, not in Georgia, not in the South, not in the argument about what war is allowed to do. Sherman proved something that the world did not want to believe. He proved that wars are not won by armies. Wars are won by breaking the civilization that supports the army. Destroy the farms, and the army starves. Destroy the railroads, and the army cannot move. Destroy the factories, and the army cannot shoot. Destroy the will, and the army cannot fight. Every war since Sherman has used his methods. The Allied bombing of Germany, that was Sherman with airplanes. The firebombing of Tokyo, Sherman with incendiaries. Economic sanctions, Sherman without the fire. Every general who has targeted infrastructure instead of soldiers is walking the road. Sherman walked from Atlanta to Savannah. The South never forgave him. 160 years later, Sherman is still the most hated man in Georgia. Families still tell stories about the march. The scars are in the land, in the family histories, in the DNA of Southern memory. Sherman burned his name into the South the way his men burned railroad rails around trees, permanently. But Sherman did not do it for cruelty. That is the part the South has never accepted and the North has never fully understood. Sherman loved the South. He had lived there. He had taught there. He had friends there. He destroyed it because he believed, with the absolute certainty that only Sherman possessed, that the fastest way to end the war was to make it so terrible that the South would never start another one. Was he right? The South did not start another war. But the South did not forgive either. And the freed slaves who walked behind his army, the 25,000 people who called him Moses, most of them got nothing. The 40 acres were taken back. The promise was broken. The freedom was incomplete. Sherman marched 300 miles with no supply line and changed warfare forever. He ended the Civil War, and he left behind a trail of fire that still burns in the memory of everyone who walks that road. If this story made you see Georgia differently, subscribe to the Sherman Archive. The fire Sherman set is still burning.